Well, the last time I addressed some of you, welcome to all of you, I spoke about Mary Ward, the 17th century English founder of the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary. She attempted to found a non-cloistered order for women that would address the needs of the Roman Catholic Church in the wake of the Protestant Reformation. Tonight I'm going to speak about another figure from this period whose lifespan overlaps that of Mary Ward, though she lives further on into the 17th century. This is Marie de l'Incarnation, Marie of the Incarnation, who lived from 1599 to 1672. Like Mary Ward, Marie de l'Incarnation had close ties with the Jesuit order, and like her, she was intensely interested in the missionary efforts of the Counter-Reformation Roman Catholic Church. But the arena for her missionary activity was far from the British Isles and continental Europe. Marie was active in France's struggling colonial outpost in North America, in the territory we now know as the Canadian province of Quebec. Marie is widely regarded as having set up the first Catholic school in North America, the first convent in North America, and was a moving force in the colony as a whole. She was a woman of enormous practical ability, but also a woman of mystical gifts and deep, unyielding faith. She is also a controversial figure, perhaps to some even an unsympathetic one. I say this because when I teach her in my course on women in the Catholic tradition, students often criticize her, appalled by some of the choices she made on the way to her missionary vocation, about which I'll tell you tonight. Others defend her as one who flouted the expectations for women operative at the time to pursue a position of power and influence in an environment open to opportunities for women long since closed off in the old world. Discussions get lively. Sometimes voices are raised. Marie de l'Incarnation makes for an exciting day in the classroom, and I always think that's a good thing. As we will see, Marie has extraordinary talents, but she comes to exercise them in Quebec after a difficult personal journey that sets her at odds with her husband, her sister, her father, and her son in ways that are sometimes shocking, even heartbreaking. Marie is of particular interest within the context of these Tuohy lectures because, again, like Mary Ward, she exercises her missionary vocation in a culture that is religiously pluralistic in a couple of ways. As I will describe, the colony of Quebec is one of many colonies, European kingdoms established in the early modern period to recreate on foreign soil the unified Christian society that the Reformation had brought to an end in Europe. But intentions do not always match up with reality, and Quebec will be no different. Throughout the period of Marie's residence, the colony will witness struggles between the Huguenot merchants, whose commercial activities provide the initial impetus for the colony's establishment, and the devout Catholic patrons and missionaries who see the colony predominantly as a vehicle for Catholic evangelization. And just to be clear about my terms, I use the word Huguenots to describe the French Protestants who followed the teaching of the reformer Jean Calvin, otherwise known as John Calvin. Missionaries of both Catholic and Protestant faiths, in turn, encounter the religious other in the form of various Native American tribes in Quebecois territory, whether Algonquin, Montagnais, Huron, or Iroquois. As we will see, Marie judges all, Huguenot or Native American, by how they respond to the Catholic missionary appeal. And her judgments admit no shades of gray. Whereas Mary Ward operates in a Britain where denominational lines are not yet hard and fast, enabling her to accept the help of Protestants in her mission, as we saw last week, trying to evangelize her own aunt, Marie de l'Incarnation will see all in light of the newly reiterated teaching of the Council of Trent, which stated in no uncertain terms that there was no salvation outside the Roman Catholic Church. The other women we will look at in upcoming lectures, all of them from times closer to our own, will express a tolerance for those of other faiths, probably much more congenial to Catholics with a post-Vatican II outlook. It must be admitted at the outset, Marie de l'Incarnation will not share this outlook. Yet I will try to outline her genuine heroism in pursuing her mission, however alien her motivation might seem to modern eyes. It will be for you to judge whether that heroism justifies the recognition the Catholic Church has granted her, despite her self-conscious religious intolerance and her questionable personal choices. Marie de l'Incarnation was born Marie Guyard in the town of Tours, France, in 1599. Tours is in the central western part of the state on the Loire River, so it's about somewhere around here. The date of Marie's birth is significant. It is 1 year after King Henry IV, himself a convert to Catholicism from Calvinism, issued the Edict of Nantes, which strove to end the wars of religion the Reformation unleashed in France by granting Protestants legal rights, including freedom of worship. Hence, it is important to note that Marie grows up in a society that offers legal toleration for religious pluralism granted within a general Christian environment, and the edict will hold throughout her lifetime. Marie came from a solidly bourgeois family. Her father was a successful baker. Marie's parents were observant Catholics, and Marie was brought up with all of the typical practices and devotions of Catholic culture in the early modern period. From the descriptions she gives in her autobiographical writings, Marie seems to have had visions as a child, which may have disposed her to a religious vocation as she grew up. However, when she expressed such a desire as an adolescent, her parents judged religious life unsuitable for her, and instead arranged a marriage for her at age 17 to a silk merchant whose name was Claude Martin. Marie says little about the marriage other than that her husband supported her in her religious observances. The couple had a son in the year 1617, Claude Jr., but the child had not even passed his first birthday when Marie's husband suddenly died, leaving her in charge of his business, which at the time was failing. As a sign of things to come, instead of declaring bankruptcy, Marie set to work to salvage the business and seems to have had some success. She returned to her father's house while she was embroiled in these business negotiations. Her son lived with a wet nurse for the first 2 years of his life. Shortly after her husband's death, Marie had what she thereafter called her conversion, a vivid vision of immersion in the precious blood of Christ. She immediately entered into a period of intense asceticism and prayer, which is typical of converts in the history of spirituality. One could cite the example of Ignatius Loyola. Within a short time, Marie's sister prevailed upon her to come and live with her and to help out with her husband's successful carting and import-export business. Marie began by helping out with the cooking, laundry, and nursing for the staff that resided in the family home, as was typical of home-based businesses in early modern Europe. However, recognizing her intelligence, Marie's brother-in-law drew her into the day-to-day running of the business. By this time, Marie's son was back with her, presumably being cared for at home, while Marie went off to work every day. This period of Marie's life was somewhat schizophrenic. On the one hand, she was living a life of continual prayer and asceticism, spending long nights in meditation and bodily mortification. On the other, she was the chief operating officer of a national corporation that at its height was providing services to the French army. Hugely responsible position. As she herself admits, she was highly successful at the latter, having what she calls un talent pour négoce, a head for business. And her employees were far from refined, given the nature of the business. They were big, brawny men, rugged sailors, the pre-Ford equivalent of truckers. She's always trying to get them to go to confession. I always say it was sort of St. Teresa of Avila meets the Teamsters. Interestingly, Marie speaks of this time in her life in a passage from the Relation of 1654, her most extensive autobiography written at her son Claude's request. In the only reference she makes in this document to Calvinist Christians, she says, "I was so deeply absorbed in my thoughts that not even business transactions with the neighbor could distract me. One time when I was with some Huguenots in a store transacting some business with them, I felt in the depths of my soul a kind of heaven, experiencing a movement which bound me to this divine mystery." This vignette no doubt reflects the demographic reality that Huguenots were resident in Tours and active in the merchant class. But in context, it is also symbolic of the painful division Marie felt at the time between her intense religiosity and everything else that stood in the way of it. Yes, her business obligations, but also her obligations to her sister, her father, and her son. This division, moreover, opens out into a bigger divide Marie begins to experience between the world and her growing desire for retreat into a life focused solely on religion in a convent. Significantly, the Huguenots, the Calvinist Christians, are definitely within the realm of the world, everything that is in opposition to a life of devotion according to Catholic orthodoxy. Marie worked in her brother-in-law's carding business for about 10 years, from roughly 1621 to 1631. Throughout this period, her desire for religious life escalated, and she sought, one might even say recruited, various parties to her cause: her spiritual director, the local bishop, the superior of the convent she eventually entered. Her family opposed the idea vehemently. Her father was aged. The sister and brother-in-law didn't want to lose their most valuable employee in the family business. The claims of her child seemed obvious to all. Marie was, after all, a single parent. Nevertheless, in 1631, Marie entered, by special arrangement without dowry, the relatively new convent in Tours of the Ursuline order. And here we have a picture of that convent. A little bit of information about the Ursulines. In 1535, St. Angela de Merici founded the Order of St. Ursula in Brescia, Italy, for the instruction of girls. Like the members of Mary Ward's Institute, the Ursulines did not intend at the outset to take solemn vows or to observe strict cloister. However, as we saw last time with Mary Ward, the post-Tridentine Church was hostile to such innovations in female religious life. And by the time the Ursulines opened a house in Tours, they looked much like other traditional orders, with solemn vows and strict cloister. They continued their educational work, but did so by bringing girls into the convent cloister for instruction. The choice of the Ursulines may have been a bit surprising to those who knew Marie, who seemed to have been headed for one of the more austere contemplative orders, for example, like the Reformed Carmelites of St. Teresa of Avila. They had been in France since 1604. But Marie's language on her choice of the Ursulines is revealing. She says she was attracted to the Ursulines because they sought, very simply, to help souls. This is the same language Ignatius Loyola uses in his autobiography to describe the initial impulses to ministry that eventually resulted in the founding of the Society of Jesus. Perhaps Marie already sensed that, like Mary Ward, she needed to be a contemplative in action, that only the kind of active ministry she would eventually exercise in the Ursuline order would enable her to balance out the warring impulses in her character between her intense attraction to prayer and retirement and her obvious gifts for constructive activity in society. Now you may ask, what happened to Marie's son when she entered the convent? She says, she's a little wobbly on this detail, she says he's 11, sometimes she says he's close to 12 or just turned 12 at the time that she entered. He had been with her while she was living with her sister and running the family business. One of the things that plagued Marie during this period was the fact that she was not accumulating any wealth and thus not providing for her son's future education or financial security. She had taken a private vow of poverty. However, she was convinced that she was doing right because she was committed to the religious virtue of poverty and wanted what she called this true wealth for her son too. When she entered the convent, she had gotten her sister and her brother-in-law to agree that they would act as guardians for her son and to pay for his education. He subsequently went to the Jesuit college at Rennes and eventually joined the Benedictine order. Now granted, to be 11 or 12 years old at a time when life expectancy for men was probably not much more than 40, it's not to be that young by contemporary standards. Still, Marie admits that on the day she entered the convent, her son cried bitterly. Marie says of this, "Watching him, it seemed to me that I was being cut in two. Nevertheless, I did not let my emotions show." Perhaps because of her impassivity in the early weeks of her novitiate, Marie's son came to the convent gate every day, often with his little school friends, to cry, "Give me back my mother. I want my mother." Marie confesses to having been mystified at the depth of his distress, for she says, "Since his infancy, I had been determined to leave him in obedience to God. I had never fondled him as one does with children, despite my deep love. My intention was to detach him from me in view of the time when he would be old enough for me to leave him." This is probably the most shocking admission Marie makes in any of her writings, at least to modern eyes. And for many, it is the statement that will guarantee she will never progress to full canonization. Pope John Paul II beatified her in 1980. Nevertheless, it should be noted, again, that Marie entered religious life with the full support of the ecclesiastical authorities of her day, her spiritual director, the local bishop, and the Ursuline superior. Moreover, this support provides the perfect counter-evidence to claims that the Roman Catholic Church has always required women to put family obligation before professional development or aspirations. It's usually when we discuss this incident that my students start screaming and throwing things around. Again, not that I always think that's bad in a classroom. In any case, Marie was not in the convent too long when she had another visionary experience, this time of a heavily forested land far, far away, and God's call to her to win this vast land for Christ. Marie says she knew nothing of the French missions in Canada before she had this vision, but this is highly unlikely. The missions in Quebec were heavily advertised in France in the early 17th century and were the focus of much enthusiasm, prayer, and fundraising among the devout in France. Marie surely knew something about Canada before she had her vision. The significance of the latter is that it triggered in her an impassioned desire to go to Canada herself and to participate in the conversion of the Native Americans there. Let me give you a bit of background on the origins of the French colony of New France. I've got a couple of maps from a book I consulted. From the earliest days of the 16th century, French sailors came to the eastern coast of Canada, including the mouth of the St. Lawrence River, to fish for cod, which was dried and salted for shipment back to Europe. Later, the area became a prime source of beaver pelts, which were used for making hats into the 18th century. Thus, European interest in Canada and New France was originally predominantly commercial. Given that French Calvinists were heavily represented in the merchant class of French society, they were involved in the transatlantic trade and early schemes to colonize the region from earliest times. Commissions to establish colonies were usually granted in exchange for trade monopolies on materials exported from the colonies, and Huguenots were often given such commissions. For example, in 1541, King Francis I of France commissioned Jean-François de la Roque, a Huguenot, to set up a colony in the St. Lawrence River Valley. Similar commissions to Huguenots were issued later in the 16th century for French colonization in Brazil and Florida. You have another commission given to a Huguenot for the colonization of French Canada in 1600. For example, when Pierre Chauvin de Tonnetuy was charged with establishing a permanent trading post at Tadoussac on the St. Lawrence. And Tadoussac is here. It's right at the mouth of the Saguenay River, quite a ways up. It's a long journey up from Quebec. It's actually an enormously scenic spot from which you can take a ferry across the river to the south shore of the St. Lawrence riverbank, along which there are some very beautiful resorts, and I'm happy to share the names of some with you after this lecture. In 1604, another Huguenot, Pierre de Gouat de Mont, was charged with establishing a colony in Acadia. So, whoops. Right around here. Again, in reality, all these commissions had commercial and political goals, since the French king saw colonization as essential to holding lucrative territory that would eventually be attractive to competing European powers in the Americas, such as the English and the Spanish. Ostensibly, however, these commissions, going back to the first one to de la Roque in 1541, had a religious goal, which was to spread the Christian faith among the Native Americans. By 1588, such commissions began to state with greater explicitness that the purpose of colonization was to convert Native Americans specifically to Roman Catholicism. The conflicts inherent in these commissions, that is, Huguenots, French Protestants, charged with establishing colonies devoted to Catholic evangelization, would eventually lead to conflict and disruption in the colonies. For example, the commission granted to Pierre de Mont in 1604 gave him permission to practice his Protestant religion while in Acadia, and so he brought a Protestant minister to Canada with him. But because de Mont was also charged with promoting Catholicism, he also brought over a Catholic priest to evangelize the Native Americans. Unfortunately, the Protestant minister and the Catholic priest eventually came to blows over their religious differences and competing efforts to evangelize. They were, however, buried in the same grave when both succumbed to scurvy, which plagued many of the earliest settlements in Quebec. In 1608, it was de Mont who sent Samuel de Champlain further down the St. Lawrence to establish the city we now know as Quebec City, which has just passed its 400th anniversary. Champlain himself was a convert to Catholicism from Calvinism who married a woman whose father was also a convert, but he complained that the Huguenots resident in the colony attempted to convert Native Americans to Protestant Christianity. Again, further evidence of the competing goals of Frenchmen involved in the colonization of New France. In 1620, a royal decree tried to address the conflict by forbidding Huguenots to practice their religion openly in New France, even though in that very same year, another Huguenot, Guillaume de Caen, was granted a trade monopoly in the territory in partnership with Catholics. The Recollet Fathers, members of a branch of the Franciscan order who came to missionize in 1615, supported the decree of 1620 against the Huguenots. Indeed, they wanted to exclude Huguenots altogether from the colony. They finally got their wish with the establishment of the Company of 100 Associates in 1627 under Cardinal Richelieu. Richelieu granted the Company of 100 Associates a trade monopoly on goods exported from New France and control over the entire territory claimed by France in America, from Florida to the Arctic and from Lake Huron to Newfoundland. Membership in the company was exclusively Catholic, and Richelieu also charged it with bringing over 4,000 colonists in 15 years, all of whom had to be Roman Catholic. At that point, the official policy of the colony forbade the practice of Protestantism and denied the right of permanent residence to Huguenots. Huguenots were allowed to pass in and out of the colony on business, and even to winter over in the colony when it was too dangerous to sail the Atlantic, but they could not become permanent residents with the legal rights pertaining to that status. This policy continued until the British conquered New France, a process completed by 1763. Now, what I want you to take away from this brief history is the awareness that early Quebec is a hybrid society. It's hybrid both demographically and ideologically. On the one hand, it's really a commercial venture established for the abundant natural resources the region provided and the opportunity for colonial expansion. Huguenots were essential to this endeavor. They ran the trade and they ran the ships that brought people and goods to and from the colony. Despite official prohibitions on their residence, they continued to be an important and growing part of early Quebecois society. Indeed, they were invaluable. On the other hand, early Quebec also becomes another potential site for the religious conflicts of post-Reformation European society, and those conflicts simmer beneath the surface during the colony's initial years. Still, Roman Catholicism got the upper hand early on in the competition between Catholics and Protestants for dominance in the new colony. This transformed Quebec into the arena in which the devout Catholics of France could manifest all the devotion and single-minded idealism they may have felt were being eroded in their own native kingdom, which was still operating under the Edict of Nantes and would be until 1685, 13 years after Marie's death. The spirituality one sees in the early Quebec mission reflects the Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation, which fragmented European Christianity and challenged the authority of the Roman Catholic Church. The Council of Trent reasserted the authority of the Church over against Protestants with its reiteration of the claim that there is no salvation outside the Church. But there was an important extension of this conviction as Europeans encountered non-Christians in the lands such as Asia and the Americas that the age of exploration had discovered. The native peoples were also counted as outside the church and incapable of salvation unless in the church as baptized Catholics. From Marie de l'Incarnation's perspective, Christ had already died for these peoples, and divine justice required that they be brought to the Lord. Hence, unless missionaries went to catechize and baptize native peoples, Christ would be cheated, as it were, of what belonged rightfully to him. These convictions spurred, enormous enthusiasm and outlays of money and energy on the part of devout Catholics eager to support the missionary movement. Patrons put vast sums into sending missionaries out and then establishing convents and monasteries, missions, hospitals, and schools. Missionaries then crossed the Atlantic and had to build new lives from the ground up, while running huge personal risks from the dangers of disease, the harsh climate, and native attacks. Given her abilities and natural determination, this was a challenge tailor-made for Marie de l'Incarnation. By the early 1630s, the Jesuits, who had taken over the Quebec missions from the Franciscan Recollet Fathers in 1625, had begun calling for the establishment of a women's teaching order in the colony. And this plea probably lies at the origin of Marie's visionary inspiration to go to Canada. It took Marie several years to get permission from her Ursuline superiors to do so, but as we might have expected from what we already know of her, she eventually got her way and departed for the colony in the year 1639. Once again, the departure from her native land involved a painful scene with her son Claude. Marie was on her way to Paris, from which she would depart for the port of Dieppe, and had stopped in the city of Orléans. There her son Claude appeared and confronted her. He had up to this time no knowledge at all of her plans to leave Europe, and had only learned about them from his aunt, Marie's sister, who, trying to pressure Marie to abandon the Quebec mission, cut off financial support for her son, now a philosophy student at the city's university. You can imagine this was another bad moment in an already challenged relationship, which Marie and her son Claude hash out in letters for the rest of their lives, though they never meet again in person. She never apologizes for her decision to enter religious life when he was still a child, saying, "You have been abandoned by your mother and your relatives, yet hasn't this abandonment been to your advantage?" He responds by expressing the pious hope that she will be martyred in New France. Yes, just like the Jesuits. And I'm going to tell you what happened to them in a minute. This is not good. All I can say is a Freudian would have a field day with these two. Very complicated relationship. But Marie persists once again in the face of family opposition and the sheer difficulty of the trip. The sea journey was perilous. The ship ran out of fresh water shortly after leaving port. The smell of fish, provisions, and unwashed human bodies below decks was pervasive. Probably due to dehydration, Marie suffered a constant headache and severe insomnia during the entire 3-month journey. The ship was at risk of capture by Dutch allies of the Spanish and Muslim pirates from North Africa, the so-called Barbary pirates. At one point in the North Atlantic, the ship nearly hit a gigantic iceberg, the Titanic scenario just narrowly averted. But it did finally arrive, and Marie and her 2 Ursuline companions joined the few hundred settlers in the new colony on a bluff overlooking the St. Lawrence in an age without home insulation, central heating, or for that matter, polar tech or thinsulate. Marie had to start her mission from scratch, beginning with learning the languages of the Native Americans from the Jesuits. She eventually was able to compose a catechism in Huron and dictionaries in both Huron and Algonquin, all unfortunately now lost. Marie also had to set up her convent and her school, eventually constructing sizable buildings for them, which involved buying land, hiring architects, engineers, and workers, and paying for materials and services. For some time, she had the support of a female patron, the devout heiress Madame de la Peltrie, whose fortune financed her work initially. But Madame de la Peltrie, who was as mercurial as she was devout, abruptly withdrew that support only 3 years later when she decamped for the new mission of Montreal, established in 1642, leaving Marie high and dry to find new sources of funding for her convent and school. Luckily, Marie had succeeded in getting the initial buildings constructed before Madame de la Peltrie departed for Montreal. Unluckily, this first collection of buildings burned down in 1650, along with most of the community's stores for that year. Here's a picture, actually, of a later version of the rebuilt Ursuline convent in Quebec City. So there was lots of work to do just to get the material life of the mission going. And Marie's business background was a tremendous asset as she strove to meet these challenges. Of course, then there was the work of the mission proper. Marie seems to have offered three sorts of services to the early Quebec colony. First, she ran a day school for native girls. Secondly, she ran a convent school for both native girls and the daughters of the French colonists, wherein the girls lived permanently within the cloister with the nuns. Thirdly and lastly, she ran a kind of informal hostel in the parlor of the convent, where the nuns offered food and beverages and some basic catechesis to native children and adults. In the early years, the Ursulines ministered to members of the Algonquin and Montagnais tribes, who were semi-nomadic peoples who survived by hunting and gathering, some of whom the Jesuits were teaching agriculture on a reservation at Sillery outside Quebec proper. After 1650, the Ursulines ministered to the semi-agricultural Hurons, who came to Quebec from Ontario as refugees in the wake of the Iroquois Wars. As many historians have noted, in the minds of the missionaries, Christianization of the Native Americans involved Europeanization, or specifically, in Marie's case, Frenchification. Native girls not only had to adopt the Christian religion, they also had to adopt the French language, dress, and standards of hygiene. While this project has been questioned in post-colonial criticism, one cannot doubt Marie's sincere devotion to the cause, which enabled her to embrace the difficulties of her task with passion and a perhaps unexpected humor. In the relation of 1654, she says, "The filth of the savage children, who were not yet used to the cleanliness of the French, sometimes led us to find a shoe in a cooking pot. And every day we discovered hair and charcoal, which, however, did not disgust us. People who came to visit and to whom we told these stories for amusement could not understand how we could adjust to this. Still less did they understand how we could embrace these little orphans, holding them on our laps, when their bodies were heavily smeared with bear grease and covered only by a small greasy rag, giving them a terrible odor. For us, all this was unimaginable happiness." Of course, the latter statement acquires all the more poignancy when we recall that Marie refused to show her own son the affection she lavished on her Native American charges. Still, her writings make it clear that Marie's commitment was genuine and totally single-minded. She was going to do whatever it took to bring her pupils into the bosom of the Roman Catholic Church. She was so single-minded, in fact, that despite the fact that Huguenots were present in the colony and essential to its economic infrastructure, she hardly ever mentions them in her voluminous correspondence, except to note, for example, when a government figure or a military figure converts to Catholicism. One reference in a letter from 1661 is telling. It appears in a story Marie recounts of a man who employed sorcery to compel a woman to marry him. For the crime, he was executed, the only record of such an event in New France at a time when the European witch craze was gaining momentum. Marie notes that he was a Protestant whom the bishop forced to convert, revealing, I think, the link in Marie's mind between Protestant Christianity and witchcraft, an echo of her earlier association of life in the fallen world of business with Huguenots. This story, moreover, occurs in a letter to her son that addresses one of the biggest threats Marie and her associates faced in the Quebec mission. This was Iroquois attacks. And here we have a picture of a guerrière Iroquois, a Iroquois warrior. The Jesuits had been evangelizing the Huron tribes in central Ontario on the shores of Lake Huron since the 1630s. The Hurons were valuable to the French settlers as suppliers of beaver pelts from tribes further west in the interior. But from 1642 onwards, the Iroquois, by this time based in central New York State, began to launch increasingly aggressive attacks on the Hurons. The reasons for these attacks were numerous, including competition for the fur trade and the efforts of the Iroquois to repopulate their own ranks, which European diseases like smallpox had decimated. Insofar as the French colonists through the Jesuits were allied with the Hurons, they were vulnerable to attack from the Hurons' enemies, the Iroquois. The Iroquois themselves were more or less allied with the Protestant Dutch and English powers in the Hudson River Valley. The Iroquois attacks are famous, of course, from the story of the North American Jesuit martyrs, who were killed at various times in the later 1640s. Since this is after dinner, I won't go into the specifics, but the brutality of their executions was notable. In the reports that the Jesuits sent back to France every year between 1639 and 1673, the Jesuit Relations, the writers describe ritual torture, often for several weeks, cannibalism, even forced self-cannibalism, that is, ripping bits of flesh off the victims and making them eat them themselves, scalping, dismemberment, and clubbing with tomahawks. Here are some historical engravings depicting the martyrdom of the Jesuit missionaries. Here is an Iroquois tomahawk of a type you see frequently in Quebec missions with that big, heavy ball at the end. You can be sure if that you got hit in the head with one of these, it would hurt. Here's another type of tomahawk from the Iroquois. It's actually reproductions of Iroquois tomahawks. It was reported that during his torture, Father Jean de Brébeuf had a necklace of red-hot tomahawks like these placed around his neck. Again, knowing what happened to the Jesuits gives a certain oomph to Claude Martin's desire that his mother suffer martyrdom in Quebec. But it is a fact. Since the attacks on the Jesuit missions occurred well after Marie's arrival in the colony, she knew all about them. And they were a constant threat to the work of the Ursulines and other female religious working in the colony. For example, the hospital sisters of Saint Augustin, who staffed the Hôtel Dieu, or the hospital in Quebec City. Marie's comments about the Iroquois attacks have a certain brutality themselves. As we would expect, she is sympathetic to the converted Hurons, who are the victims of these attacks, and completely hostile to the Iroquois, who in her eyes stand condemned because they rejected the gospel of the Catholic missionaries. She attributes the Iroquois' behavior to demonic possession and invokes the Old Testament law of an eye for an eye, claiming that when the French defeat the Iroquois, they will hand them over to the Hurons' allies, the Algonquins, who will subject them to the same brutal torture the Iroquois inflicted on their enemies. Very interestingly, as one scholar notes, Marie likens the French settlers' effort to eliminate the Iroquois threat to a holy war or a crusade, those medieval wars that European Christians waged to wrest the Holy Land from its Muslim rulers. Marie uses this language at a time when there is ongoing warfare on the European continent to resist the encroachment of the Ottoman Turks onto Eastern European soil. Several of the military governors of New France during Marie's time in the colony were veterans of these wars against the Ottoman Turks in Europe. But whether they were Iroquois or Turks, Marie's attitude towards those who reject Catholic Christianity was uncompromising. Such persons were condemned to eternal hellfire, and rightly so. Now, despite the relatively better response French missionaries received from the Huron and Algonquin tribes, it is a fact that the 17th century French mission in Quebec overall, and Marie's schools for Native girls in particular, were not successful. Marie's efforts to Christianize Native American girls was probably undone by her tandem efforts to Frenchify them, to subject them to the restrictions of cloister and to the social mores of bourgeois French society, at odds with the freedom and, it might be noted, the powerful, even dominant position of women in some of these Native societies. So what are we to make of Marie de l'Incarnation? She certainly does not represent a mindset that seeks to find Catholicism's place in a pluralistic religious world. Just the opposite. She represents the classic Counter-Reformation effort to force that pluralistic world to conform without exception to the dictates of European and Tridentine Catholicism. Indeed, I would describe Marie as having a kind of tunnel vision, one that only sees reality in terms of the Roman Church and potential converts to that church. The very lack of attention to Huguenots in New France, despite their presence and critical importance to the economy of the colony, which otherwise one might have expected of such an astute businesswoman as Marie, is telling in this regard. Perhaps more tragically, even the members of her family lay outside the purview of this tunnel vision, only coming into focus when they make an institutional commitment to the church Marie serves, as her son eventually does when he becomes a Benedictine monk and priest. I think most of us would agree that the perspective Marie brings to her missionary vocation is not one we would necessarily want to share in modern-day North America. And yet to deny her self-sacrifice and her real achievements would be unfair too. This is a person who painfully gave up family connections, and her pain on leaving her son is very real in her autobiographical writings. She took on real physical hardship, danger, and tremendous work. Her efforts had lasting effects, including the establishment of parochial education on the North American continent and the establishment of female religious life here, which offered women, both in Canada and the United States, tremendous opportunities to build both the educational and social service infrastructures of both countries. If we revere the gentle Saint Elizabeth Seton, like Marie, a mother and wife before she became a nun, we have to admit that she could not have emerged in North American Catholicism without the life and work of Marie de l'Incarnation. Like the Savior for whom she sacrificed all, Marie de l'Incarnation is a sign of contradiction in the history of the North American Church, who invites criticism and admiration, perhaps in equal measure. Thank you for your attention.